As humans, our thought processes are plagued with all manner of cognitive biases, but there's one bias that could be the most fundamental, a bias that could be labelled morality's biggest taboo: existence bias. In this video, I simply want to bring attention to existence bias and how it might hinder us in thinking clearly about the ethics of creating people.
Why do people have such a hard time accepting antinatalist conclusions or antinatalism as a whole? Why is there such a barrier, do you think?
Biology. I think there are eons of evolutionary history of which we are the product. And that is going to militate in most cases, not of course with all people, we're going to have exceptions, but in general, in the human species, that's going to militate against acceptance of antinatalist ideas.
I think existence bias might be one of the features of human psychology that, as Benatar puts it, militates against the acceptance of antinatalist ideas. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What exactly is existence bias? Well, the first time I came across the term existence bias was in the essay of Thomas Metzinger called Suffering. Our deepest cognitive bias is existence bias, which means that we simply do almost anything to prolong our existence. Sustaining one's existence is the default goal in almost every case of uncertainty, even if it may violate rationality constraints, simply because it is a biological imperative that has been burned into our nervous system over millennia. And he outlines it more comprehensively in his book, The Elephant and the Blind: Existence Bias, a physically embodied top-level preference leading human beings to almost always opt for sustaining their own existence. Even if doing so is not in their own best interest, it leads to a fundamental distortion in our model of reality and to a high-level cognitive bias in which our own mere existence is treated as evidence for the goodness of that existence. Now, at least to me, it kind of makes sense that we would have this bias. After all, we're the product of a evolutionary process that selects for genetic fitness, the ability to reproduce and pass on genes to the next generation. And I think existence bias would lend itself to increasing the chances of an individual's reproductive success in at least two ways. The first is that an individual operating under existence bias would be more likely to continue to exist even under very bad conditions, and so they would presumably have even more potential opportunities to reproduce. The second is that they would be more likely to take those opportunities and actually reproduce. And that second point is what I want to focus on in this video: how existence bias influences our procreative decisions, and it surely does. Again, in his essay Suffering, Metzinger says this: we are systems that have been optimized to procreate as effectively as possible and to sustain their existence for millions of years. In this process, a large set of cognitive biases have been installed in our self-model. It seems entirely plausible that existence bias would have been one of these cognitive biases, but it will take conceiving of existence bias in a slightly different way than we have so far to more comprehensively understand how it would influence our procreative decisions. In the post Three Tricky Biases, Human Bias, Existence Bias, and Happy Bias from the Effective Altruism Forum, Stephen Rourke lays out this second conception of existence bias. We all already exist as biologically evolved beings, which may influence us to systemically overvalue the potential future existence of other biologically evolved beings. And I think this way of conceiving of existence bias and the original way of conceiving of it actually interlink as well. To understand how they interlink, let's look at the example of optimism bias. Optimism bias, as David Benatar explains in his essay The Optimism Delusion, is the delusional belief that things are or were or will be better than they really are or were or will be. Optimism can take various forms, but the relevant one here is optimism about humanity and the human condition. Both optimism bias and existence bias are examples of cognitive biases that would militate in favor of procreation, as well as continuing to exist when it's not in one's interests. And they both do this in two ways. Metzinger sketches out these two ways in the case of optimism bias and how they interlink, and I think the same dynamics are present with existence bias. If, on the finest introspective level of phenomenological granularity that is functionally available to it, a self-conscious system would discover too many negatively valenced moments, then this discovery might paralyze it and prevent it from procreating. The logic of psychological evolution mandates concealment of the fact from the self-modeling system caught on the hedonic treadmill. It would be an advantage if insights into the deep structure of its own mind, insights of the type just sketched, were not reflected in its conscious self-model too strongly, and if it suffered from a robust version of optimism bias. Perhaps it is exactly the main function of the human self-model model's higher levels to drive the organism continuously forward, to generate a functionally adequate form of self-deception, glossing over everyday life's ugly details by developing a grandiose and unrealistically optimistic inner story, a narrative self-model with which we can identify. Now, that was a load of complicated words, but in simpler terms, what he's saying is that optimism bias, and I would say similar dynamics go for existence bias as well, inhibits our ability to soberly reflect on the predicament of our existence. And very quickly, if you want to learn more about what the predicament of our existence is, then check out my video, Why Your Life is Worse Than You Think. It's linked in the description. But anyway, in doing so, these two cognitive biases inhibit our ability to reflect on our lives in such a way that would, one, lead us to conclude that it wouldn't be rational to continue to exist when conditions are sufficiently bad, and two, deter us from procreating. As a result, an individual operating under existence bias would presumably be more likely to procreate because, as I said before, they would be more likely to continue to exist even in very bad conditions, and so come across more potential opportunities to reproduce, and then two, they would take those opportunities to reproduce, or they'd be more likely to. So hopefully that conveys somewhat of an understanding of existence bias and how it would influence our decision making around procreation, in that it biases us towards procreating in at least two separate ways. Now I want to take a look at a specific example of how existence bias would contort our thinking around the ethics of procreation. And that example is our consistent inability to accurately consider the counterfactual case where we never came into existence. I've done a full video on this called I'm Glad to Be Born Debunked, and again that's linked in the description. And in that video I go over specific examples of how people fail to consider their own never coming into existence in an accurate way, and how that leads to them making biased judgments about their coming into existence. But in short, if we cannot understand that our never coming into existence wouldn't have been bad for us, then it's going to hinder us in thinking clearly about whether we should start new lives as well. And as a result, the judgments we're going to come to as a result of that thought process are going to be unreliable. This is not to say that the judgment someone comes to, whatever it is going to be wrong, just that it's come about via a thought process that hasn't considered all of the relevant factors accurately. If we're biased from the word go toward thinking that existence is a fundamental good, then we'll be biased towards starting lives, and we will probably end up starting lives that we otherwise wouldn't have started were we to have been thinking clearly. Even if you don't think that would apply to all lives as an antinatalist would, you may think that would only apply to some lives, but nevertheless the bias would still lead us to do things that we actually wouldn't have done were we to be thinking clearly. To elaborate further on this, let's go back to a footnote in the essay by Stephen Rourke. Our love for life or existence, or our deep sadness about contemplating non-existence, are what we would expect ourselves to feel given that we are biologically evolved beings. Similarly, questions about the potential existence of other beings can bring up positive feelings related to having children, being a parent or aunt or uncle, etc., which are also deeply embedded in us as evolved beings. But these judgments don't necessarily translate into ethical recommendations about the value of creating new sentient beings. Deeply ingrained feelings about our existence color our moral intuitions and influence our reasoning, often without us fully understanding how these feelings are nudging us in a certain direction. He then goes on to give specific examples of how existence bias might show up in our thinking. Existence bias would influence someone to claim that the potential existence of a sentient being is fundamentally more valuable than their non-existence. Existence bias would influence someone to grant more value to futures with increased numbers of sentient beings and devalue futures with decreased numbers of sentient beings. And existence bias would influence someone to think that creating happy beings is a net positive act rather than a neutral or a negative act. Throughout that article, Stephen has included a whole range of footnotes and links, so I've linked the main post in the description if you want to go and look at it and read it in full. Existence bias will influence our thinking and our moral judgments in all sorts of ways, some subtle and some significant. If you want to see a really striking example of existence bias in operation in someone's thinking, then check out the video by Kurzgesagt called The Last Human, A Glimpse into the Far Future. It's simply assumed that the existence of many humans in the far future would be a positive thing. And if we acted in such a way where those many people wouldn't come into existence, then that would be a tragedy. Again, watch the video. It's almost drunk on existence bias. And if you want to explore the topic of existence bias further, I've got two recommendations for you. And both of them are works of Thomas Metzinger. The first one keeps on the topic of this video, and that's his essay, Benevolent Artificial Antinatalism. This essay explores a hypothetical scenario in which a super intelligent and benevolent benevolent artificial intelligence comes to be somehow and understands our ways of thinking better than us. And as Metzinger says, it has a deep knowledge of the cognitive biases which evolution has implemented in our cognitive self-model and which hinders us in rational, evidence-based moral cognition. The superintelligence concludes that non-existence is in the own best interest of all future self-conscious beings on this planet. Empirically, it knows that naturally evolved biological creatures are unable to realize this fact because of their firmly anchored existence bias. The superintelligence decides to act benevolently, and the benevolent artificial intelligence facilitates voluntary human extinction via non-reproduction. Again, read the essay if you want to see the full thought experiment and Metzinger's thoughts as well. The second recommendation is a section from his book that I mentioned before, The Elephant and the Blind. In it, he discusses how existence bias might influence other areas of our psychology as well. I haven't covered these aspects in this video because it's not super relevant to the topic of procreative ethics, but if you want to read more about existence bias and how it has wider influence over our psychology, then the section I'm talking about in that book starts at around page 185, 186. You can also just look at the index of the book for the term existence bias. And perhaps something else to look into if people are interested in this topic is just pessimistic philosophy more generally. This seems to me like a whole area of philosophy that actually doesn't really suffer that much from existence bias, because part of pessimistic philosophy is that coming into existence or existence itself is a negative thing. Of course, more research needs to be done into the topic of existence bias. There has been some done, but it would be super interesting to see how it specifically ties to the topic of procreative ethics and how it influences our decision making around procreation. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I miss anything out? And I'll see you in the next one.